All right, we're back.
Good morning, Brian.
Joe Meyer, thanks for joining.
My pleasure. Thank
As you can see, if you're watching on video, it's perfectly dark outside. Joe invited me to the campus of IU Health, which is a fantastic campus. I've actually never been here, so I found the parking location well, so that was good. I was worried I was going to be driving around downtown Indy, but thanks for having me, and thanks for doing a morning episode. I'm a morning person, so I'm trying to record these episodes late in the evening, and it's nice to do it in the morning. So.
Yeah, it's my pleasure to have you here. And I think depending on how the morning begins, we'll probably see that in the background as it begins to get light.
Nice sunrise. Pull that just a little bit closer. All right, cool. So, Joe, you have a ton of background or ton of breadth of knowledge and depth. But when we first connected, you told me a few stories about where you started. So I want to kick off there, and the term that jumped out, and I mean it in an endearing way, is tech nerd. That seems like where you started. Yep. So would you agree with that branding and tell a few stories about where you started?
No, I would, and it was sort of like the tech nerd under cover of a business person. But I started my first 5 years of my career was in consulting at Anderson in Chicago after I finished my undergrad. And very quickly, I gravitated toward PCs and databases and kind of technical aspects of the.
When was that? Just relative time?
Yeah,
frame?
To put some markers on this. So 1990. Okay. I finished college in 1990. And it's interesting because during those years, when I started college, I had a typewriter. And people who had access to the computer labs, that became common during my 4 years, but was not the norm in the fall of 1986. But by my graduation, of course, PCs were more common that people owned. So I entered the workforce at this very interesting transition time where in consulting, we had secretarial pools that had, done a lot of the typesetting and creating presentations, and that became a staff function during my early years at Anderson. And I was bitten by the bug. And I'd had an interest in computers from my high school days. We had the lab consisted of a couple of Apple IIe's in a closet of a math teacher's classroom. But that followed me into the workplace. And so very early, I found myself doing a lot of data analytics and analysis on DOS-based database tools. Yeah. And it kind of stuck with me. And in that first 5 years, I went from being kind of a PC nerd to building Lotus Notes databases and knowledge management tools during that first 5 years. It synced up with me going to graduate school, and I was at Northwestern as the commercial internet was really beginning. So I had access to the internet through Northwestern's computer center before it was really that common. But during the time that I was in grad school and those first 5 years of work, Netscape happened. Mm-hmm. People began to get access to the World Wide Web in quotes. Yep. And I was hooked. Yeah, I was hooked.
Was it more of a side project that you just had an interest in outside of your core job, and then it grew into something more than that?
Yeah, exactly. It was. The side project with Notes, Lotus Notes, was to support a team that I was working on to build some data share tools. And what happened during that time was another colleague and I got very interested in the burgeoning commercial internet. So we and another colleague, there were three of us, hatched a skunkworks project to launch what was to have been Arthur Andersen's first internet presence. And this was in 1994. We were found out by the chief marketing officer and one of his staff that we were trying to launch this website, and we were asked to stop and then help the firm launch its website. So actually, if you turning the clock back, remember when companies were launching their first presence on the web? Yeah. This other colleague, whose name was also Joe, and I were asked to help Arthur Andersen build its first website, which we did, which was unplanned and really fantastic. So in answer to the question, the skunkworks project turned into my full-time job. And I finished grad school at that time, around the same time, and ended up taking a job with a software company in the suburbs of Chicago that was building this a go-to-market strategy around the internet at that time.
And did you seek this out? Did it kind of come from curiosity, or where? I guess how did you? Was it just something that looked interesting and you were kind of drawn to it?
Yeah, so that's exactly right, Brian.
Okay.
It was curiosity, and then when you have an interest in things, opportunities tend to present, and so that creates a bit of a self kind of fulfilling loop. But that's exactly how it happened. I would say separately in my career, being intellectually curious has served me very well. And as a consequence, as we were discussing a few minutes ago, the number of things I've done over 30 years of my work life are highly varied, but all have this common attribute that just a genuine intellectual curiosity has led me into different fields and different industries.
And I think it's common that the interesting stuff is a lot of times the new stuff. And I think there's a common misconception, especially for like early career professionals or someone that maybe doesn't have a lot of tenure, that it's like, someone else is the expert. But in a lot of cases, especially in healthcare, science, a lot of what we're doing is so cutting edge and brand new, and the approach is so new, and we need fresh perspectives more than we need the experience kind of heavy set, like a lot of background in a certain area.
Yep. I totally agree. Yeah, I totally agree. I'm thinking of a Steve Jobs quote, that when you have a project or a problem to solve, you can try to find someone that has done it or claimed to have done it 3 times, 5 times in their career. Or you can find somebody who you think can do it. And often, these new problems, or as you integrate knowledge from different disciplines, are brought to bear on the current problem. Having fresh eyes is often really powerful.
Right. So talk through, so you said you joined a software firm, and then when did healthcare come into the picture?
So the kind of a chunk of years, so my kind of 3 career arcs. The first was consulting with some of these technology pieces I've mentioned. Then I was in the tech space. This is really fueled by this internet passion that I had in the mid-90s.
And that was when it was booming, right?
Correct.
Yeah, so that was in the heart of
all
boom.
Brand new, and yes. And then in 2004, I had an opportunity to go to Roche Diagnostics here in Indianapolis, and was a vice president of marketing for the US professional diagnostics business, which is about $1 billion business in the US. And it was a transition to a much larger leadership role in a much larger company. And that was 2004, so 15 years ago now. And the pivot, I'll share this with you. The pivot was simple: to enter a field where human health was at the other end of our work.
Right.
And so this sort of parallels my own kind of personal interest with where I wanted to spend my time to make a difference.
Yeah. So talk about going from a startup, smaller company to a large conglomerate. I bet that transition was there came with some challenges, I imagine, or just some differences.
It did.
Yeah.
Yep. Exactly right, Brian. Yeah. So I've told this to some others. One of the most easy to see differences is in how, when you're in a small company, you talk about the business and the number of customers that you have, and how quickly you're growing. I was at a Primo immediately before joining Roche, and essentially the chief marketing officer there. Primo was, some here in Indianapolis will know the company, was a ground-up startup. Two former colleagues and friends started that in one of their houses, literally one of those stories. But at a Primo, we talked about our growth rates very loosely, and we could be talking about the last quarter or the last year. And so when we were asked how quickly the company was growing, it could be 30% or 40%, whatever. And when I went to Roche, growth rates were measured in 1/10%, because this was a multi-billion-dollar industry, and essentially being off by 1% against the market would have equated to tens of millions of dollars of profit. And so one of the very significant adjustments was the precision with which large companies run the business, and that probably took only 3 or so months to figure that piece out.
Sure.
It happened fast,
Yeah.
but a big adjustment.
Yeah. So when you talk about a couple of transitions you had, were those transitions you seeked out, or did you kind of come up to the end of your role and it just felt like the right time, or how do you approach those different transitions?
Yeah, good question. So two pieces. I would always say the intellectual curiosity core, was a driver in every transition I've made. But the other piece was, I'd always because I'm so curious, if I felt like I was doing the same role a second or a third time, I became open to other challenges, frankly. And really at each transition I've made, that's the common theme, because that's what puts me, or I think this will resonate with other people, kind of in a listening mode. And so the challenge of Roche, one of the things that appealed to me, I already mentioned, was having human health at the other end of the work, which is, just natively
it changes
of
the
value.
equation.
Yep. And the second piece there was the leadership opportunity to manage a bigger team and to have a chance to, there were some things going on that I was involved in on the nonprofit side that gave me some interest in, more explicit leadership. So those were the two pieces that led me to Roche.
Okay. And that leadership piece I think is interesting, because a lot of, I guess, what's your experience on the other side of leadership? Because I just took my first supervisory position, and I was one of the hyper-aggressive young gun people at my company and wanted to get to leadership as quickly as possible. And then in getting there, there's so much of it you don't see until you actually do it.
Yep.
And what advice would you have for people that want to move into leadership or move up in corporations?
So maybe we'll turn this interview around and I'll interview you as a new leader, Brian.
Feel free.
I think one piece of advice that I've gotten and that I continue to get is understand your motivations, for why in the role. And I think new leadership opportunities, my experience, it was driven by a couple of pieces. One was ambition. In your individual contributor role, you see an opportunity to have a bigger impact and to grow your career. And when I was in an earlier stage in my career, very honestly, there was a piece of it that was simply ambition.
Yeah.
What I've learned over time, and this I mentioned some nonprofit work, some board work, some church work actually as well, also coaching youth sports. There's another dynamic to leading people and creating these high functioning teams that's its own reward.
Yeah.
And that I would say came secondary to early. It was really more of kind of a native ambition.
And pausing on that, I guess there's a couple ways to look at it, right? You could look at it as a burden, because you do have heavy responsibility when people rely on your leadership to make sure that their futures are bright. Yeah. On the other side of it, though, I think it's a huge opportunity where if you can lead. I always think about leadership. If you lead effectively, you grow the pie and make more opportunities in the future. So it's kind of a double-edged sword in a lot of ways. Would you agree with that?
I do. And I think one of the hallmarks of leaders as they grow into these roles, I shared this actually at one of our IU Health leadership forums just a couple months back, that you're thinking as a leader when the first thing in your mind in the morning is not your own work,
right?
But it's the health of the team, the functioning of the team. That really, I think, is a clear marker that you really approach your work as a leader. But you're right, you have a chance to make a very significant difference as a leader in the organization broadly, for the team specifically, the work the team is doing, but even in an often a more impactful way with the individuals themselves. So you invest in those, the people that you're working with and leading, and see them grow. And I think this is another thing you hear earlier in your career, that it's often later in your career that you kind of measure success by how many other leaders you've helped to grow, but that really does become true.
Yeah, definitely. So then what's the best way to get to leadership, would you say? Because I've heard a lot of people that I trust, the best advice I've gotten is focus on what's right in front of you and do the best job possible. There's got to be a truth to that, but is there anything else that stands out to kind of help move towards? Yeah,
these are the pieces of advice when your earlier career that are frustrating. They don't seem to make sense. How do you get ready for the next level? Things like do your current job well. Yeah, that turned out to be true, by the way.
Especially if it's documentation, or it doesn't have to be anything large and impactful. But if you do it well,
that's exactly right. Often you'll hear the advice, perform into the next job before you've been formally given the role or the title, and that's also true.
Yeah.
I think there is a part where you have to declare interest and be clear about what you want as well. In larger companies, sometimes those processes are a little bit more well understood because there's sort of a culture of advancement, a culture of the building the lower foundation of a career where you touch certain responsibilities that in some ways naturally play to the next role. In smaller companies, that's not true or as true, and so being clear and declaring what you're interested in doing, I think, becomes equally important. But there's no those two pieces of early advice. There's no substitute. If you're not performing well in your current role and people can't see you in the next role, it's
going to be
unlikely you'll talk yourself into it.
Yeah, right. And in performing in your current role, performing in your current role, there's, I guess, some reservation sometimes because you think you'll get stuck in there.
Right.
But I guess in your experience leading teams, those people stand out that do their job really well, right?
They do. There's no question.
Yeah,
there's no question. And ultimately, one of the this has been invariably true. One of the dynamics of a strong performer in current role, if they have they can declare what they might be interested in next, and they have their eyes up, they'll get more to do in their current job.
Yeah.
And that's so you can see the creep. Exactly. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. So as you transition to leading a large organization, I assume prior to joining Roche, you had a number of smaller teams, and then this was kind of a big jump, and it was a larger organization. What were the differences between those two dynamics for kind of large versus small?
Yep. I'll give you a couple of themes. One is, and you'll hear this is a common kind of transition point, but managing managers or leading people who lead people. And that is a significant mindset shift. Another is recognizing how much impact your presence has.
Sure.
And I think there's people say it in a kind of a simple way, but people will watch how you're working, they'll watch how you're behaving. And as your leadership roles grow, that takes on ever more leverage. And it's not the case that you can't have a bad day, but it is true that all of these very subtle things really matter. People in the environment are looking to their leaders for not just the verbal direction and the project definition and what priorities you have, but also how you approach the work.
Sure.
Are you positive? Do you bring a sense of can-do to these environments? Are you tackling the hard issues?
Yeah.
And it's interesting, and that's a shift because in smaller environments, you can often lead, I would say, shoulder to shoulder, and maybe in a more casual way. But that does change as the organizations grow.
When the organization grows, you can't. Your time's limited, right?
That's exactly right. Yeah, that's exactly right. For a smaller group, a team, if it's 10 or 12 people or whatever the number happens to be, you can physically get to that group. Yeah.
That's interesting you say that, how you carry yourself, and I want to tease that out a little bit because I got a lucky experience that I led a new hire group at my organization and was able to every quarter see almost all the leaders come together for a week to just overview our entire organization. And the thing that I pulled away from that experience was leaders show up every day and deliver. And I think as I reflected on that and tried to, I realized in my delivery it was quite a bit of variance, and I tried to smooth that out. And the way I did that was by focusing on myself, my habits, improving the way you carry yourself. I think that gets a little bit lost in the conversation a lot of times when you talk about leadership.
Yeah, those are great observations. It's actually another great hallmark of your own career arc, Brian, to recognize that.
Yep.
There's a lot of power in looking at leaders that are effective, that you don't have to admire all leaders for the same reasons, but to see some of these commonalities. And I do think that's it. Showing up every day really matters. Big organizations or big projects or big opportunities, they're never achieved, in a single, burst of energy or inspiration.
It's a marathon. Yeah.
Not a huge I mean, I like Steve Jobs for some reasons, I don't for others. But I'll throw another Jobs quote out. When Pixar went public, it had been a failed private company, and he rescued the company. And there was some backstory about how much the early shareholders were squeezed out. But when it went public, Jobs was quoted as saying it had $1 billion market valuation the day it went public. This is the Pixar Animation Studios. And Steve Jobs said, behind every success story like Pixar, there is one great idea and 10 years of hard work. And so you look at the leaders in large enterprises like where you're working now, and nothing significant can happen in a short period of time. So being there every day and it matters.
Being persistent, yep. So as you came, the other piece of the transition from Aperio to Roche that I'm interested in is how the domain area shifted.
Yeah.
So talk about how you learned healthcare, because my experience was I was a business school major, and I thought I had a bunch of business concepts and could understand markets, and then I came into healthcare and it was just like, okay, I guess I have to relearn it from the ground up, because there's not a lot of similarities to other markets.
Yeah. Well, I'll tell you the bridge, and then I'll tell you what a trusted colleague told me very early on. The bridge was when I went to Roche, we were in a technical market selling large diagnostic equipment and other hospital-based diagnostic equipment through a direct sales force. These were $1 million+ contracts that had long terms, roughly 4 to 5 years on average, often longer. So the transition for me was I understood the business model. I'd been in businesses that were business to business, that had a direct sales force, that had basically a technical product being sold to a technical buyer. That model to me was well understood.
Okay.
So that was the leverage point. The industry, of course, was new, and I had lots to learn. And this is the second point. A good friend of mine said to me very early on, here's what makes healthcare hard. The person that prescribes it is not the person that may use it, which is not the person it's intended to help. And none of those are the people that pay for it. And so this becomes the real complexity in healthcare. And I said, kind of prescribe and use, but often you've got, and think about pharmaceuticals or in healthcare and hospital environments, you've got technical committees or a formulary, and this is true with payer or reimbursement or people that will say your product can be covered. So you've got a decision-making entity, then a physician might actually understand the patient and write the prescription, or in our case, a diagnostic test, or, provide some care. The patient, of course, is in the middle. Increasingly in the U.S., we have a little bit more patient responsibility as the economics have shifted, but still largely all that is intermediated by a payer, by another third party. And that's what makes the ecosystem so challenging as you try to bring a product or service into that mix.
Yeah. So it's probably the advice people could take away is learn that high overarching process, and you have to understand that to even have a foot in the door.
Right.
Yeah. Right. So once you get past there, then it's about trying to figure out your piece of the process and then how you work effectively in there.
Correct.
Okay.
Yeah, correct.
So as you said your title was marketing. What all was involved in that?
Yep. So the transition to Roche, I was the vice president of marketing for the U.S. professional diagnostics business. I had a group that was responsible for supporting our sales team. Think of this as like a kind of an outbound product management group, may resonate, or kind of a field or sales enablement. We had a separate group that was responsible for inbound requirements. And really helping build product definition and product roadmaps with our global teams who direct the research and development spend. We had a team that was in that construct of kind of outbound and inbound marketing that was focused on all of the instruments or the hardware, one that was focused on the reagents or the tests, with both directions of work. We had a group that was responsible for all of our communications, trade shows, events, public relations, advertising. And we had a group that was responsible, we called it market analytics, but kind of the analytic pieces, pricing, profitability for deals, project support, deal support for our sales team, and then some real enablement like account intelligence, which was, think of this more as kind of share of wallet analysis for the existing installed base.
Yeah.
What products and services could we sell into our existing installed base? So that was kind of our market analytics group. And part of that work included voice of customer and market research.
Yeah, I think that's the common misconception with marketing, is that it's just putting out ads and trying to raise awareness. I mean, your marketing's a part of the mix in healthcare.
Correct.
Yeah. So then, I guess when you were leading that team, how do you, as a vice president or a leader of that large of an organization, are you looking 1, 2, 5 years out? Like, what's your purview? Because I imagine you have to balance it between the here and now versus the future, and that's kind of the crux of the challenge of leading a large scale organization.
Yes, and the inherent trade-offs that kind of present themselves. It was a mix, and we had. In that role for the U.S. business at Roche, we were, think of it as essentially a sales affiliate. So our first job was to deliver current year's revenue and profit. So that consumed, probably, 65% of my time as a vice president, and that included working with sales teams on big project deals, pricing deals. A range of things. The next piece would be, probably in this sort of 18 to 24 months, but we were always looking for programs that had leverage or go-to-market strategies that had leverage, and that could be size and shape of the sales team. It could be how we bundled an offer. It could be working with industry influencers to have a preferred place for Roche in the mix. And that work set was extensive, but we knew, that was really never a current year payback.
Right.
And in terms of the time spent there, maybe I said roughly 65% or 2/3 of the time was kind of in year. Maybe you split the last third in half. But we also had significant work with the product requirements and the roadmaps that we were working with our global teams. And those timelines are, for medical device, for pharma, are always very long, in part because of the regulatory cycles.
Right. I was worried you're going to add up the percentages in this.
172.
Yeah, right. That's usually how it works. It's like, wait, hold on. I got to go recalculate these percentages. So medical diagnostics, I think, is an interesting area because a lot of people, the general public, hopefully only sees them a handful of times in their life. So what's something maybe that most folks wouldn't know about medical diagnostics, or how has that industry evolved over time?
I would say there's probably two. One is the degree of automation and you can look at this in many industries.
Well, maybe before you go there, define medical diagnostics, just to make sure everyone's clear.
Sure. So simply said, and the branch that I'm in, because you can think of how you might diagnose a patient in other ways, like a physical examination. But the work that we do here at IU Health and that I've done at Roche is being able to collect a specimen, and that could be blood, it could be other specimen types. Commonly, people will take urine tests. People are often familiar with this. If you have a pre-employment drug screen, you're looking for potential, illicit drug use. But there are a number of sample types. Some of these sample types are tissue. So if you have a biopsy, maybe you've got a skin lesion. And essentially, so taking that sample from a patient and then performing some analysis on it, which can be biochemical, it can be a process of doing something specific to the tissue that's been removed, stain it with an antibody, or process it in a way that lets a pathologist look at it more closely. So the field largely is, simply put, taking a sample, as I defined it, from a patient, and then through some biochemical or other process being able to get some deeper insight about what that tells you. People think about cholesterol, or their when they have maybe an annual physical. How's your glucose, your A1C, is that high or not? And that's the work. The interesting thing about diagnostics, that workflow is complex because you're usually moving those samples to an offsite laboratory.
Right. That was going to be my first question. Do you own? I guess, how much do you own of that process, right? That kind of back to the original macro.
Yeah, from a macro standpoint, in a hospital setting, we own almost all of it.
Okay.
So we have our team members are at the point of collection, or one of our hospital partners would be, where we take the original sample. Some come out of surgery, if you've got a surgical resection for a cancer. And then we manage the chain, if you will, from collection to transport to ultimate processing and providing whatever the answer or the result is.
Yeah. And back to my point about how most patients probably have no insight to that.
You would never know.
You think it just goes in the back room, they do some sort of magic.
Stuff.
Yeah, right? Yeah, that stuff is probably pretty important and difficult to manage because it's just such a complex scientific process.
And there's multiple disciplines as a consequence. And that's another thing. People, and I mean, true of me as I started my laboratory journey, you think of the lab as a single thing. She suggested it's the back room. But ultimately, there are probably a dozen, say, modalities or technology types that span this basic question, can I take something out of a patient and give them an answer? There are more than a dozen ways we do that.
Yeah, and do you define or do you design each process individually? I'm sure there's some overlap, right?
There is overlap, right?
Okay.
So back to the good question, Brian, kind of this macro point. So if you have to move a specimen, there's a lot of similarity in how that works.
Okay.
So a test that can be done on a blood specimen that's collected at a patient, at the bedside or at an outpatient center, the process we run to get that sample here and tested, that overarching process is the same. What happens when the blood arrives here depends on what we're testing for. And that's where you start to see some differences in terms of what we do.
Sure. Okay. So back to then my question, how's it changed or how is it changing and evolving?
Yep, so really interesting. So one is, like other manufacturing industries, there's been a theme over the last 20 or 30 years to provide more automation. And this is common. You think about, arguments that we have in our economy today, where the former kind of, where's the labor in the economy? But there's been a very clear trend toward more automation. There's also been an explosion of technology. And this happens kind of in every generation. Today we're really riding the wave of genomics.
Sure.
And we're riding the wave of informatics. And so the nature of the work that we do in the lab today, there are pieces that look unchanged, and there are pieces that are unrecognizable to what a laboratory looked like 30 years ago or even 10 years ago.
Yeah. So what does automation look like? Do you is it the transfer of the specimens or is it the actual analysis?
It's the preparation of the sample and the analysis.
Okay.
So 30 years ago, you would have technicians dealing with an individual patient specimen kind of one by one, maybe literally pipetting a smaller sample and doing some kind of manual chemistry.
Sure.
Today that's automated. The tube itself that carries that, the blood specimen will be untouched once it reaches our laboratory.
Wow.
So it's probably a 5-step process. I won't bore you with it, but ultimately it's untouched. It goes from this kind of whole blood sample that we collected at an outpatient center to storage without once it's been loaded on the front end of this automation, without intervention. And
that's
we
insane.
could do 20 or 30 tests on that. We can make smaller, they're called aliquots, but smaller samples, which could be performed elsewhere here at IU Health or even at another laboratory if needed. And then all of the results that come back, the quality checking, how those results are ultimately prepared and released back to the electronic medical record there's no human intervention.
So does that just look like a bunch of robots moving at lightning speed behind the scenes?
Yes.
Okay, that's amazing. Yeah, I've gotten to see a few videos like that, and
Yep.
it makes your head spin. It's like, what is happening? What did we design, right? That's awesome. So then on the technology side, thinking back to the 90s when the internet was just coming to be, I feel like we're almost in a similar spot in healthcare and where all these new technologies are just starting to trend up.
Yeah.
Would you, don't crush my soul if it's not the case, but would you say that's along the same lines or does it feel similar?
It feels similar.
Yeah.
And I think healthcare, because of the complexities, at least the more established players, we're catching up to some of those technologies because the ecosystem is so complex. But it is some of these larger themes, especially around informatics and really kind of freeing and enabling information in the healthcare context, really exploding, really exploding. And I think of every sector. I mean, I've worked in diagnostics, I've worked in pharma, I'm in the delivery side now at IU Health, and just see the power of being able to really kind of, and I would say liberate first, but make this data, this discrete data, available in different ways. And we're in the cusp of a very significant pivot point now.
Okay, good.
Yeah.
You didn't,
So
you
you're not
didn't-
crushed at all.
Okay, good. Yeah.
There's way more work ahead of us.
Right. So that work ahead of us, I imagine the hardest part is you have to deliver. We're not in the business of retail where we can just try, or Netflix. Netflix, they said they deploy code 30 times a day, and if a movie title doesn't show up wrong, it's like, okay, we'll just redesign it. We don't have that luxury in healthcare. So I imagine that's the hardest challenge. You have to continue to maintain the quality of the tests and results while trying to improve it.
Yep, exactly right. So innovating safely, and some of the our wrappers in our businesses are they're regulatory wrappers.
What do you mean? What do you mean by wrappers?
So the context within which we operate.
Okay.
So if you want to bring
just
a new
kind of like the rules,
correct
rules, guidelines,
regulatory. Yep, and some are very, very stringent. Like in the case of a diagnostic test, you can't literally sell or market that test until the FDA has said you can, and then what you say about that test is narrowly defined to that which the FDA reviewed and approved, essentially the claim. In healthcare, there's a little bit more latitude because we're practicing medicine. This is the piece you hear often in the industry. And yet there is very significant, kind of safety and regulatory parameters and guidelines, very significant. And ultimately, people in healthcare would a lot of this we would have created anyway because we're taking care of patients and we want to be safe.
Yep. Yeah, it's for good reason. And it's always about trying to stay in that balance between making sure everything's safe and effective, but also not
innovating, bringing innovation and science to the patient.
Yeah. So do you feel like would you say you're constrained by the regulations at this point, or are they pretty well keeping up? It's always, again, it's a balance. I'm not trying to knock regulators. They probably have one of the hardest jobs just to make sure they remain in control, because the downsides, we probably should lead off with the downsides. If you don't get it right, how impactful and dangerous that can be, right?
You can mistreat someone and ultimately death or, very serious illness could follow. So the risks are very significant. We started our conversation by describing some of the differences between small and large and going from a software company to Roche. And I didn't mention this. I talked about the specificity of market share and growth. But operating in a regulated business was also a very significant learning for me. And quickly I became deeply grateful and respectful of the why. And in my time at Lilly, I would say, this is something that became very visible because you just know at the end of this work, and in any phase of pharmaceutical development or bringing those medicines to market to help patients, you know that ultimately a patient will be injected or will swallow a medicine. And that's humbling. And I think in healthcare, we have a lot of tests that are common, like work that might support an annual physical, but we also have a lot of tests that are critical. Does your mom have cancer? What's the answer? Because how we treat, our parents or how we treat patients matters. It's going to be directed by the result of that test. We have a good friend of mine's daughter about a month ago was diagnosed with leukemia, and that work was done in our laboratory here at IU Health, and it matters because how you type that cancer, that childhood cancer early, governs the induction phase of chemotherapy. Ultimately, will help dictate that young girl's outcome. And so when you see those cases come through, you just realize that we want a small margin of error.
Right. Yeah, and it kind of makes it real, right? And that I don't know about you, but I've found I guess the times that for me where those dots have connected, like from work to personal, those really are motivating, right? Because it gives you a different level of energy and recognition of what you're doing.
Agreed.
And I think that hopefully everyone that's in healthcare has some element of that, because I think that's a great driving force for your career and being aspirational. So I wanted to, the other question I had, what you're doing, even just talking through it at a high level, there's so much complexity and science, and you, like me, don't have a science background. So I'm wondering how do you approach the level of depth you get to? Because you could go way deep and learn all the science, but I don't think that's probably the most effective or really needed. But you do need some level of depth to be able to lead and implement things effectively, right?
It's another very good question. Being a natural learner, being curious helps, because you may go a little deeper than you need, but it's just the energy you have to learn. But ultimately, you're right. I mean, we have technical experts. We have a group of pathologists and scientists here that ultimately are, and our technical teams as well, not just the medical and scientific staff, but our technical team, our medical technologists that are very deep and skilled in how these tools and instruments work. And ultimately, there's a level as a leader, your job is to facilitate the right kind of conversation. And I think you develop a sense for helping ensure that those conversations are balanced and honest.
Yes.
Without understanding maybe the final strokes of the science.
Sure.
And that's a skill that can be cultivated and can be learned. And I think it's also the mark of leadership, and it's true in other areas too, maybe functional areas if you are a finance person but have to go work in regulatory or something, or a marketing person that's going to go work in a finance role or something where you don't have technical depth as well. But often the mark of your leadership development is that point at which you're managing something that you don't have deep understanding of. And for everyone, at a certain point in your career, if you're maybe beyond kind of first promotion or second promotion, that will be true. And learning to navigate that conversation is really important. So, yep, I think being curious matters, being able to ensure you've got a balanced conversation, a fair and honest conversation. And part of it, too, is being deeply respectful of the technical expertise that you have. And some of that comes from personal relationship and working together.
Sure. And I think it does require a bit of courage, because you have to ask sometimes the dumb questions, and it's not always easy, but you've seen me now for 45 minutes, and I'm not shy to talk. So I've used that skill of mine to just not be shy and ask the questions. And I've had so many people come up to me and say, "Thank you for asking that question."
Right.
I had that exact same question. Right.
Yeah.
And has that been your experience too? And
it has been in a very, very similar way.
Mm-hmm.
It's often early you're afraid to ask, and then you get more comfortable asking those questions. Yeah.
And especially if working with scientists, I've had quite a few interactions with scientists now, and I think I've seen them get so jazzed when you ask them, explain what you actually do, because so many people just overlook it and want to stay at the high level because it is complex.
And often they love to teach it.
Yep, they love it. And you want to get, sometimes you have to say, pump the brakes just a little bit. I think I got it. Well, this has been great. On medical diagnostics, or any other kind of domain-specific specific ideas or topics, is there anything we missed that's noteworthy that is worth mentioning?
No. I mean, the themes that come to mind we've touched on. I think being curious, wanting to serve your team and serve your organization, I think are really important. Let's say awarenesses, perhaps, to understand that. I also I mentioned it in passing, Brian, but I would come back to it when you're in earlier stages of career. This is another piece of advice that is often offered. You can develop outside of a professional context. So this is the volunteering or serving on a nonprofit board. That's absolutely true. And not only do you get some professional, sort of exposure or feedback, but I also think you start to learn about your own motivations and see where, what you're really being called to do. And it's, and so take advantage of those opportunities, I think, is another sort of general piece of advice.
Yeah, that's great advice.
I mentioned coaching and, trying to teach, a group of 12-year-olds or 9-year-olds how to hit a baseball. Really challenging, and it forces you to simplify your language and appreciate what good looks like, and know that at the end of this few months of time together that there's no future major leaguers, but having an ice cream and some friendships ultimately is a pretty good outcome too.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think that's a great point to end on. It's not always about. I think too often we talk about what did we deliver, what's the latest, but the relationships and the intangibles that go around, that's some of the, but I imagine looking back, that's the stuff you remember. You don't remember that project that you did in your fifth year your career.
Yeah, that's exactly right. Yeah, the people, you think about the people and the that sense of relationship that you have. That's exactly correct.
Yep. Well, thank you for letting me pick your brain, because I think you've had such an interesting career path and have had so many different hops, and it's interesting to hear how they progressed. I imagine in looking back on it, it probably makes more sense than it did when it was actually playing out. I think that's a commonality I've heard. But I assume your venture's not done yet. Do you still, I guess, you've gotten a number of opportunities, but do you continue to kind of look and be curious in the future? That never goes away, right?
It never goes away. In fact, since we agreed to meet this morning, I've been asked to do more for IU Health. So,
good. So the new adventures just starting.
It continues.
Yep.
Yep. And looking back, the career arc, you can draw some dots, but as you go through it, it had a lot of left turns and right turns.
Yep.
Seems very unplanned.
Yep. Great. Well, thanks again for taking the time. I really appreciate it. And as always, if you're listening, the only thing I ask is if you share this with a friend, just kind of help keep spreading the word.
Yeah.
So thanks so much, Joe.
You're welcome,
Appreciate
Ryan.
it.
Thank you.
All right. Take care.